The following podcast may include coarse language, graphic content, and politically and/or religiously sensitive material. Those of you who are offended by such content should fuck off. Hey there, we're doing the podcast again so soon. Isn't that weird?
That's so weird that I think we might be getting influenced by our future selves.
Are we? Are you your future self? Am I my future self?
I know my future self is an asshole and my past self is an idiot.
I'm one of those two, if not both, at the same time. All right, anyway, this is the Daemoneye podcast, episode 16, Time Travel. When are we? I'm Tristan Eifler.
Great Scott! It's a podcast!
Surprised you didn't go for the original inspiration of Rick and Morty there with, what was it, Rick and Marty?
Yeah, I didn't want to be that foul-mouthed.
That's a first.
Well, have you seen that video?
Yeah.
I mean, that's pushing the limits even for me, man.
Really? That wasn't that bad. I mean, the pedophilia was one thing. Okay, let's just leave it at that. All right. Anyway, this is the Daemoneye podcast where we talk about electronic and tabletop role-playing games, sci-fi and fantasy fiction, science, technology, geek culture, and the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow.
Who swallowed?
Okay, we're at cross purposes with our joke here. I was half expecting you to follow up on that line from Monty Python. I've learned not to have such expectations of you, though, and of myself.
I'd like to defy expectations by making new expectations that are then themselves defiled. Oh, whoops, I meant defied. Defied. Did I say that out loud?
Your expectations make me want to exportate. Did I say that right?
Expectorate?
Expectorate. Okay, enough pre-podcast banter. So, personal stuff first. What are you up to right now, Tyler? How is it over in New Mexico?
It's, as usual, awesome. Albuquerque is everything that California promises it is and never delivers.
Well, here in California, it's rainy, gloomy, and dark outside. It's, California winters tend to be either very clear, bright, but cold as hell, overcast and gloomy, and or rainy.
Whereas over here, temperature goes between 30 and 45 degrees during the winter, and you not infrequently end up with a white Christmas.
Fair enough, but I also heard that even with the body of water and or mountains that prevent it from getting super hot, it still gets quite unpleasant in the summertime. Of course, it's unpleasant here in California as well, but...
It does, I admit, get fairly hot here during the summer in Albuquerque. Why, sometimes sometimes it even goes as high as 10 degrees lower than the temperature in California.
Mm-hmm. All right, so there's that. I'm just kind of in the limbo between semesters right now for my full-time job, quote-unquote, as adjunct professor, and this is the almost month-long interperiod between the fall semester and the spring semester, and I'm actually quite enjoying the lack of responsibility, albeit lack of responsibility with implied responsibility. I should be working more on my fiction, personal growth, exercise, etc., etc. I've spent most of the time just hanging around watching bad YouTube videos and feeling guilty about it, I confess.
Yeah, my exercise routine consists entirely of lifting weights and beating the living crap out of a tree in my backyard.
What did the tree ever do to you?
It never leaved.
I see. That could grow on someone. I think, you really need to get to the root of your problems, Tyler.
Eventually I will. It can't resist me forever.
All right, yeah. So I have not really gotten on any of the fiction I promised, unfortunately. I'm hoping to get on that pretty soon. Writing up some more, finally finishing that damn epilogue, and actually I don't do resolutions because... Well, I just don't do resolutions, but I am trying to get back to writing more regularly as part of commitment I've been meaning to make for a while now. I mean, I just got to get back into it. That's the way you have to do it.
Yeah, you don't want to pull a J.J. Abrams and never finish anything.
No, that's R.R. Martin.
It's J.J. Abrams, too. His endings are always, like, half-assed and something that he obviously did while drunk.
Well, at least he actually finishes things, Tyler.
No, he doesn't. That's my point. He always leaves massive holes undone.
He finishes things even if they're full of holes. R.R. Martin never finishes things, period. It's one gigantic gaping hole through which nothing can get through.
That guy must be really popular in prison.
Yes, obvious joke. So there's that. And of course, game-wise, company-wise, not much to say. We've had a few trickle sales in the Christmas time. I forgot to the Christmas time sale. That's okay, though. Not a lot of new products apart from Dragonfire, but the interest in that has been limited, we admit. I think Tyler's still working on the Heroes of Horror thing.
Still grinding through, and actually also recording the weekly games that we started for the Incarnates game, where we're all playing basically classical proto-deities. I'm Loki.
Big surprise. Let's try a very experimental thing and try a look in the future, since, it is about time travel, this podcast. What do you see getting done after Heroes of Horror? What do you see on the distant horizon?
I see the world dying in nuclear fire.
Assuming that doesn't happen, what would happen?
Oh, well, assuming that doesn't happen, either going to proceed with work on the first Heroes of Horror expansion book, or go back and do some work on Dead Stars, doing it and finish up the Walking the Black expansion book.
I think a lot more of our fans are interested in Dead Stars. It's consistently popular among groups I've run here. It'd be nice to revisit that. Maybe even a new edition, maybe not a new edition per se, but a new printing of the book. That'd be a worthwhile project.
With like updated errata and all that.
Because let's face it, again, this is a tangent, but I think it's one worth going over. D&D is the definitive role-playing game and the definitive fantasy role-playing game. What is the definitive sci-fi role-playing game, Tyler?
There isn't one.
Exactly. There are a bunch of decent ones, but there is no definitive one. So that is a niche I think we could more easily insert our tiny little bit into.
I am not touching that one with a 10-foot-long pole.
You've gone soft on me, Tyler. You really have.
What can I say? It was just too hard to resist.
I guess all that heat is melting you. That's why you're going soft.
Dude, it is hotter in California where you are than it is over here. I hate to break it to you, man.
All right. I'm not.
I live in a desert and I'm cooler.
Only because you have high access. You have really good access to AC there, I'm guessing. All right.
Actually, I have my heater turned on.
Yes, my hot heater's on right now. It's like 35 degrees outside.
Yeah, over here it's 30.
Aha! Anyway, enough of this pissing contest. So, again, my personal projects still got to get back to the epilogue. A lot of projects still, I used this term before, the embryonic stage. I want to get on them. I'm hoping next week I'll finally get over this lazy funk I've been trapped in and sit down and do at least get a start, put some momentum to some of these projects I've had in mind before the semester starts up again. I only commit some of my time to them. I mean, the problem with me is that I don't go well with vacations. If I have a long period of time, there's nothing to do. I'm usually not that productive. I need something on the side pushing me, keeping me rolling. Otherwise, I'm just content to sit on the couch sometimes or the computer and watch bad movies over and over again. The old saying, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. I may be the archetype of that.
Yuck. Well, hopefully you actually can kick your own ass into gear.
I really need to. Yeah, but it's not been horrible. I do need a bit of breathing. I do need some breathing room, but some time to do nothing. I enjoy that, but again, I can do nothing too easily. That's the problem with me. So, and I've also had a chance to look over the podcast and edit it and upload it, of course. And wow, the inexperience in my end shows quite a bit. I think I used the word theme more than 24 times, and that's when I didn't really need to. So I hopefully we'll get better over time, especially if we make this a more regular thing.
Well, maybe it was just an echo from your alternate selves.
Yes, which brings us to this episode's theme, time travel. When are we? This might even continue to be a continuation of the previous podcast, which focused on interplanar travel, different dimensions. You could even consider this like a part 2 of a 2-part series, because there are a lot of similarities between time travel and dimensional travel, because time is a dimension, after all. That's actually well established in modern physics, contemporary physics.
Even though entropy's arrow always points in one direction, which is why we experience time as a forward-moving concept, we can't really go back, because you would have to undo entropy throughout the universe in order to basically rewind time, or in order to rewind it like a clock. That would be time travel in the opposite direction. But when we're talking about time travel in fiction, what we're usually looking at is trying to figure out some way to shortcut or bypass that law.
Well, to be fair, FTL travel would technically be time travel, Tyler, and FTL might be possible.
That's actually a misconception of physics. FTL travel in real space would necessitate time travel, but the FTL travel methods that we actually think exist would necessitate not being able to time travel, such as the Cuvier drive and Cuvier drive and wormholes. Although a side effect of that gives us one method of time travel we think might actually be possible with a closed time-like curve,
where basically we can't go any further back than the time the machine or the construct or the wormhole was created. Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's just kind of establish some basic concepts in time travel before we dive into its use in role-playing games. So, assuming there's time travel, there are 2 major types. There's forward and backwards. Forward time travel, that exists. That's absolutely possible to a certain extent.
Yeah, we're all doing it right now.
Yes, and, general and specific relativity. The faster we go, the rest of the universe speeds up for us. The speed of light is always going at the speed of light no matter what the reference point is. So if you could actually speed up yourself or relative to everything else, you would be moving forward in time, but it would be a one-way trip in all likelihood.
That's very true.
Mm-hmm. Now, backwards time travel, that's where things get a little tricky, and it might kind of exist in even hardcore realistic physics on a nanoscale, but on a macro scale,
That, once again, drops us into the point of closed time-like curves. Those are the only things that we can think of where in real-world science we actually might have a possibility of some sort of time travel. But with a closed time-like curve, you have problems with grandfather paradoxes.
Yes, which leads us to the 2 types. We have fixed time and plastic time, where if there is indeed some sort of backwards time travel, is it fixed time, where even if you try to kill your grandfather, it turns out it wasn't your grandfather in the first place. So no matter what you do in the past, the universe/physics will not permit you to change anything with the past. That's fixed time. There's plastic time.
You're forgetting multi-time.
That's another thing we'll get into. That's kind of almost a side thing. But in plastic time, you can change the future, which of course means you have to find a way of dealing with the grandfather paradox. It shouldn't even be possible, but a lot of sci-fi fiction uses plastic time.
Yeah.
All right.
And then in multi-time, it solves the grandfather paradox by stating that when any changes that you make to the past timeline spawn off a new timeline, and now you have 2 timelines running parallel, but you, the time traveler, are stuck in the new timeline.
Yep, and hence the overlap with dimensional travel, which we referenced in the previous podcast.
If you think about it, if you go if there's some system in place or some effect or unknown cause that allows or that makes it so that permutations in the flow of time even out the further forward that time goes, like for instance, the grandfather paradox. You go back in time, you kill your father before you're born, you're basically committing a very fancy time of suicide in a fixed time scenario. But if you go back in time and kill your grandfather before your father is born, and you find out that you're still there, Well, that's because unknown to your grandfather, your grandmother stepped out on him and got knocked up by somebody who you have no idea who they are.
Which leads us to one of the more common ways that fiction and maybe even some philosophical circles address plastic time and paradoxes. It's the idea of time with resistance. The timeline somehow is self-correcting to some extent.
Yeah.
Which is, that's more of a convenience for fiction. It probably wouldn't be the way things worked if, in any amount of hard sci-fi, or definitely not, probably 99.99% in reality. But it lets you have your cake and eat it too. You can create paradoxes, you can alter the future, but you're fighting against the time, which you can say you're fighting against the universe, which also is a nice theme, and it also gives them some liberty to have time travel and do things, but not be totally fucked up by, the grandfather paradox.
That also means, though, that we're looking at another type of planar travel where you have what's the difference between a world that's identical to our world, but 500 years prior to that, where with all of the people who inhabited it 500 years ago, where you can travel to that world and experience that world, and then back and forth, and any changes you make in the quote-unquote past world have no influences on the future. What's the difference between that and time travel, where you time travel back 500 years, but in a reality where time is any deviations that you make are self-correcting, and you do whatever the hell you want you do the same actions back there that you would have done if it was a alternate plane, and then when you travel forward in time, you don't notice any changes.
Philosophical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways you can make this work. If you really want a lot of freedom, it's really hard to use the hard fixed time or plastic time models. There are different variations of it, but you have to play with it. It depends on how you want to use it for your story or for your role-playing game. So you have options, and you have to really know what you have to do is you have to look at the models, you have to establish these rules, and once they're established, you can't really alter them, because once you alter them, you find yourself quickly in a real paradox.
Yeah. Well, now that we've covered the basic framework for what types of time travel we're talking about, wouldn't this be the point where we go into franchises and games and whatnot that use time travel?
A few more things I want to go over, a few more little odds and ends of that. One cute little idea I remember from Futurama and a few other pieces of fiction was the internal return model, wherein the universe repeats itself over and over and over again, as in untold eons, the universe has collapsed back to itself in the big squeeze, and it'll happen again, and the exact same universe will repeat itself.
Yeah, the idea of the cyclic crunch.
Which was who in modern times, I think the only person who was a fan of that was Friedrich Nietzsche. However, it was also presented in Futurama, where they could only go forward in time, but they found a way around it by going so far in time accidentally that the universe restarts itself, and they find themselves back where they need to be. That's an alternative. That is the reality. That's another little variation. Of course, in effect, you're jumping from one different universe to the other.
But if the universe repeats itself, you're also completely destroying the concept of free will and quantum indeterminacy.
Exactly. But it is one way that you would only need a forward time machine to go back in time. In effect.
That's very true.
Yeah. So that's one little variation of that.
Of course, as a side effect of that, if you had a backwards time machine, you could also end up going forward in time by going to a previous universe just further in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's one little thing I wanted to mention. Any other little variations of that model you can think of?
Not of that model, but there is a variation on a fixed and plastic time that I always found interesting, and that's the sharpshooter variation. The idea being that you can create changes in future time in events in future time by altering something in past time that then percolates forward to the future time point where you actually did your shot into the past, hence the sharpshooter variant, in order to make the change. But that change doesn't create a grandfather paradox because the previous timeline now no longer exists. So you go back, or back to the grandfather paradox. You go back in time, you kill your grandfather, you are never now born, but the you that went back in time still exists in that new timeline, and the other timeline just never happened. The only evidence that it ever was even there was the fact that you're now walking around side by side, or walking around with, like, maybe on a walker or something, or walker or something, or looking at the new child that your grandmother had with somebody completely different who isn't your father, and that new child is not your father.
Interesting. All right. So, anything? That's about it.
Yeah, that's about
all right.
it.
Well, I mean, there are other variations. I mean, there's philosophy of time travel, all these models in metaphysics. But let's not go too deep because this is a fairly well dug around subject in science, technology, and philosophy. So, and talking about this in fiction, role playing games, also very well treaded trail. I mean, there are so very many examples of time travel in fiction. What's the earliest example of time travel you can think of in fiction?
It was actually the earliest one I can think of in fiction was actually done by Crub Nuggets. I can't remember his name. It was even adapted into an animated movie decades ago, and it's about a guy who ends up traveling far into the future when essentially a computer system has caused a world war that's completely annihilated all life, and then he keeps going further and further and further into the future, and the survivors of that worldwide war have formed into Eloy and Moroi, the time machine.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that's Murlocs or Morlocks. You're thinking of actually.
Oh, sorry, Morlocks and Eloy.
Yeah, that might be the example. There are probably earlier examples of that, but that is the one that everyone thinks back to as the first time travel fiction that really got established the genre.
Yeah,
and I think it addressed forward time travel and also had backwards time travel. I'm not sure if it really addressed the paradoxes in that though. Just what if scenarios, which, is a fairly good staple that we mentioned an example of that in the previous podcast with the man in the high castle.
Yeah, That's true.
So again, there are just so very, very variations. I mean, there's Back to the Future, of course, the great trilogy.
There's the Terminator franchise, which uses the sharpshooter paradox, or the sharpshooter concept of time travel.
And it almost fixed time. Not quite, though. It has its own little weird rules, but at least they're fairly consistent when it comes to that, if you don't count some of the spin-off or sideline stories.
Yeah, the first two movies are Terminator. Everything after that is just garbage.
Mm-hmm. And geez, what else? God, it's one of those situations where you're spoiled for choice and you just can't reach out to any particular one because yeah.
There's, what was it, 1964?
Oh.
TV show that came out recently. There was that movie from about a decade or so back where the guy is not only who works for a organization that fixes discrepancies in the timeline, and it turns out that he's not only his own grandfather, he's also his own grandmother.
Futurama. I'm not sure if that was a illusion that Futurama made during the that one time travel episode. There's more classic literature there. There's the classic short story, The Sound of Thunder, which addresses the butterfly paradox quite literally. Sorry, the butterfly effect quite literally.
Speaking of which, there's also the novel series by Eric Flint, 1632. The first 2 or 3 novels were freaking awesome, but after that, it just kind of started to devolve as he started doing, his publishing company started making him do co-authorships with up-and-coming authors who had no idea how the hell to write the characters or had any idea what the hell they were writing in the time period, and it just completely just turned to crud.
Yeah, imagine a beautiful, perfect, well, not perfect, but quite interesting sine wave streaking across the collective unconscious, the inland empire of human minds. It branches a few ways as new sequels are made. It's still quite lovely, quite interesting. Then it starts to become gnarly and branch out to metastasize in this ugly morass of poorly written alternate fiction.
What I would say is a beautiful sine wave that branches off, and some of the branches are a little higher frequency, some are a little lower amplitude, but they're still fairly attractive, and then they start branching more and turn into wingdings.
We've talked about this before, but that series was an example where our shared universe just didn't work. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough discipline. There was no consistency. If it were a shared fiction on a forum, it'd be well done for its level of involvement and its enthusiasm. But as an actual published series, it's not going anywhere now. It's just a bunch of it's a bunch of different fiction threads that are all loosely in the wind. I'm sure 1632 fans out there, the current ones would disagree, but I occasionally...
It was definitely no Death Worlders.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. But it did establish another subgenre in time travel sci-fi fiction, the Island in the Sea of Time, where we have an entire group of people displaced to a different time. The predecessor to that was, of course, the time slip, where individuals sent forward or backwards in time and then influences the time. It's longer term, it's building things, it's interacting with society. The predecessor, of course, was Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. The difference is...
That's true. I think that was like one of the very first time travel novels. Written by Mark Twain.
So, of course, with Island of the Sea of Time subgenre, you have entire cities being transported up and down time. There was another example that was the Islander series from S.M. Sterling, which would be good if it weren't for its connection with the Emberverse, which is a fictional universe I despise. And S.M. Sterling, and for that's a shame, because the 3 books in the Islander series, Nantucket series, was great. It's kind of like 1632, only they're sent even further back in time to the Bronze Age.
There's also a golden gem that a lot of people don't know about. It's by an author named Leo Frankowski, who's sadly dead, but he left enough notes for how he was going to end this series that it was able to actually be ended. But so many people don't know about it that they haven't even gotten into it. The Cross-Time Engineer. It's about an engineer in from the 1980s who goes back to his ancestral home in Poland to see how his grandfathers lived, or to see the land that his grandfathers lived in. And while waiting for a hookup at a bar who never shows up, he gets so drunk and pissed out drunk that he ends up passing out in the basement, only to unknowingly end up passed out in a time machine because the inn is actually an outpost of a highly technically advanced civilization that uses time travel to make the comprehensive history of humanity. Without doing the whole non-interference thing. He wakes up, hungover, comes out of the inn, takes a whiz, basically and GTFOs out of there before he ends up getting in trouble, only to realize that, or after it's much too late to turn back, that he's actually stuck in medieval Poland right before the Mongol invasion.
The thing is, we probably go on all day, literally citing examples of this, but I think we'd be better off listing the subgenres of time travel fiction just to cover all bases. I think it's a better way of doing it.
Well, there's also something we mentioned last time that we said we were going to get into this time, if you remember.
Probably not, but so why don't you go over and remind me?
Chrono Cross?
Oh, Chrono Cross. That actually was different dimensions. I think of Chrono Trigger.
Oh, yeah, Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, it was an excellent JRPG, one of the defining ones of the SNES age. And it did use kind of a plastic but with resistance timeline there. That was a great one. So what makes it a subgenre?
Well, what I would say makes it a subgenre, it would be that it's not a subgenre, but it's a subset. The set being video games, because everything we've talked about before have been a single storyline experiences. Movies, TV shows, novels, the person actually having the experience, the reader or watcher, has no influence over that experience. But a video game, the person has to be written differently because you have to take into account what the person having the experience decides to do. Does he open door A, door B, or turn around and walk to a different building?
Okay, let's take a step back here and kind of define the types of time travel stories and or universes in fictions and role playing games and games, etc. So you have a situation where a party or individual sent usually back in time. That's one. That's kind of the time slip one. That has some sub variations where it's not by accident the person invents a time machine. That's the classic. So there's a time slip. Then there's the deliberate time machine. And there are other variations of that is where time travel is an established technology or ability of a society or even entire civilization. Time Cop, as horrible example that is one example. Terminator is kind of between the two, but there we go. Then there's the Island in the Sea of Time subgenre where it's defined by a large group being sent back in time as opposed to an individual. Okay.
Well, don't forget that there's also the idea of the you know how you have the grandfather paradox, where you go back in time and you do something that erases your own existence or your own experiences or alters what you would or how life would have been for you in the future, and therefore you could not have gone back in time. There's also the idea that you always gone back in time, that you have a time loop where your existence and ability in the future to go back in time is predicated by the fact that you had to have gone back in time to start it.
I mentioned that as a variation of the fixed time loop concept of time travel, and that is a type of time travel that's great for fiction and video games, but almost very difficult to run as a role-playing game. Yeah. So we have getting back, we have large groups going back in time. It's usually becomes some sort of, society building or culture X meets culture Y type of story, which I personally love. Then
there's also, if you're looking at forward, there's forward time travel and sometimes even backwards time travel. There's also the concept of the man out of time.
Mm-hmm. The classic example is Rip Van Winkle's story.
Yep. Somebody who wakes up and the world, or even though he hasn't changed, the world around him has.
More modern example, Idiocracy.
I love that movie, and I hate the fact that reality is becoming closer and closer to Idiocracy every year.
Yeah, it's a little disturbing. Well, in that case, it's not really. That's probably one of the more realistic types of time travel fiction where you just have to have some way of preserving a person, let time flow around you. So that is a person from the past and the future. And that's also, it's definitely a subgenre itself. Any other subgenres you can think of that involve forward time travel?
Let's see here. We had a Man Out of Time. We also have researchers. The idea that the person who does the time travel had absolutely no influence over the time travel, that it was somebody in the future who reached back and pulled him into it in order to research that era, maybe even replacing that person. That was actually a very popular concept. That was a very popular concept by H.P. Lovecraft. He actually had an entire civilization that existed in the deep past, an alien civilization that was wiped out by an apocalypse, and that civilization would exchange bodies with humans from the modern times in order to basically add to their compendium of knowledge of history.
They did more than that. They repeatedly did that over and over again so that they could be effectively immortal. It was very unpleasant for the civilization at the end to be thrust forward suddenly to an apocalypse, but that's how they survived, I think. And the race you're thinking of are called the Yithians, not to be confused with the Yithians, furries. And it was not, so that was an interesting, that actually is almost a genre itself, the idea of four-dimensional beings which somehow can move up and down the time as though it were just another dimension, like the same way that in Flat World you had a sphere which can move up and down in the third dimension. Maybe there's beings which can go back and forward in the fourth dimension. I mean, an example of that in more contemporary fiction are the scrotum monsters from Rick and Morty, which of course were...
I was just about to bring those up.
For those of you who don't know, they're based off the Langoliers from the Stephen King very odd novella, who are supposed to eat up time as the past to ensure that the future is for some other crap like that. The giant testicle monsters put to much better use as the wardens of the timeline, who all sound like African American comedians for some reason. Who boy?
Yeah, it's hilarious.
Yeah. So I think we've covered most of the well-known subgenres of time travel, and which covers most of the gamut for types of or concepts of time travel, fixed time, plastic time, etc., etc. Anything else you can think of
for genres? No, I'm pretty much spent.
All right. So now we finally get to what this podcast is allegedly about. So, it's a lot of things, but using time travel in role-playing games and or video games, electronic gaming. Okay, so we already said this, but it can be very difficult to apply some of these models of time travel to role-playing games, tabletops, because of player agency. I mean, how could you do, for example, a fixed time loop when players are trying to break the game, trying to create a paradox?
That's actually kind of funny, because in the Heroes of Horror games that we're running for the playtest, we're basically just completely screwing up history all the damn time.
But in a fixed time loop, the GM would have to conceive of some way to undo all the players' actions to make it so it was being possible, and or their actions just are part of history. That's a tricky thing.
The only way I can think of that would be relatively easy would be have a time limit on time travel. For instance, the TV show Travelers specified that time travel was so disruptive to reality that it was impossible to go back to a time period earlier than than the most recent time travelers travel backwards in time. So any alterations let's say time traveler A goes back in time and shoots Hitler and then goes off and lives his life. Now in the future, the time traveling civilization that sent him back to kill Hitler still sees that World War II happened. They do some research and go, damn it, he accidentally killed Hitler's body double. So they have to send another time traveler back in time. But they can't send that time traveler back in time before the previous time traveler arrived to let him know, yeah, you're about to kill the wrong guy. Hitler's actually over there. So what they have to do is they have to send the second time traveler to after the first time traveler arrived and go, wait a minute, dude, stop. That guy's not really Hitler. And then just hope that the first time traveler doesn't shoot the second time traveler in the face, thinking that he's somebody from an enemy faction in the future who wants Hitler to survive.
Yeah, that idea of as soon as you open the floodgates, you have all these different possible timelines converge, and you have all these different time travelers appear and start, fucking with you. I mean, that was in that last Rick and Morty episode with the snakes, and it actually happened in Family Guy, of all things, where they go back in time to do something. They have to go back in time to stop that time travel from doing something, but then it turns out, oh wait, there's this other time traveler who wants from a further future who wants you to do it anyways, and so on and so forth.
Another idea of a similar limited time would be the idea that you can time travel to any period in history you want, but you can only do it for, let's say, 24 hours, and that's it. Mm-hmm.
There's actually a role-playing game of a niche one called Continuum. Have you heard of that?
I heard of a TV show called.
Well, this is a role-playing game, kind of an artsy-fartsy one, where there's a time-traveling society, and whenever you create a temporal paradox, it's basically the universe automatically repairs it to some extent, but you get fragged. Essentially, the more paradoxes you attempt to create, it has a destructive impact on your own individual timeline. You start to fade away, a la Back to the Future. So you can do it, but A, it's limited, and B, the more you do it, the more frag points you develop, and you get too many frag points, you get head out of existence, because your act of trying to disrupt time create disruption, and you are caught in the wave of that.
Well, you can also do, you can also you can run your game using the sharpshooter rule for time travel, so you can alter history to any damn degree you want. But if you then travel forward in time, you're traveling forward in time in the new, now altered timeline, and it doesn't matter whether or not you exist. If you make it so that time travel is unidirectional, as in the machine that sends you backwards in time once you've gone backwards in time, you then have to proceed forward at the normal rate. You can't then just hop forward in time. Then you won't have the ability to go backwards in time, shoot Hitler, go forwards in time, find out it was a body double, go backwards in time, shoot the Hitler, and then shoot where Hitler actually is. Instead, you go backwards in time, you shoot Hitler, go off to live your life, only to find out that World War II still happens and still proceeds apace, and you done fucked up.
Yeah, these sort of long-winded scenarios are quite commonplace, and again, in time travel, and it's hard to apply that to a role-playing setting. It requires a lot of foresight on the GM's part. If you want to use kind of a plastic time set, you have to have consequences and rules for dealing with this sort of thing. In the AD&D, this is going way back, there was a rare supplement for time travel called Chronomancer. I actually have a copy of that. It's kind of hard to find these days, where it was kind of a plastic time, but with a resistance model, where you could mess with time, but they were A, time police, and B, the more disruption you cause the timeline, you would basically be thrown into the plane of time, basically. In other words, as soon as you're about to create a paradox that would cause too much disruption, you would be sucked in to a alternate reality of time, universal, and that would be the end of it. But you could still travel forward and backwards in time to some extent to observe the future and or alter the past to some extent, but it would be very difficult.
In a novel in a series, or in the novel Dire Time, which is part of the Dire Saga series, which is a series that I always recommend, and I think I've done so in damn near every podcast because it is just freaking awesome and it covers damn near every genre you can think of. The main character gets sent back in time and has to go forward in time the old-fashioned way, one day at a time, slowly as you go. But she's stuck in which basically means she's now stuck in World War II. But obviously she doesn't want to be. But the only way to basically hit the recall button and go forwards in time is to actually create a paradox in a universe where time is in a universe where the timeline is semi-self-correcting. So what she sets out to do she sets out to actually kill Hitler during World War II in order to break time so that she can get flushed, or so that the universe, in order to fix the timeline, will flush her back to her point of origin, and so it can reset everything that she did, so that everything that she did since she got sent backwards in time can be reset or undone.
Yep. So I think the moral of all this rambling is that if you want to do time travel in a role-playing game, you're really better off doing a plastic time model with resistance, probably, to control players' actions. A fixed time travel is really hard to do, and it might require. And if you do try to do a fixed time in role-playing games, it will require a lot of Deus Ex Machina, which is something you want to avoid as a GM, honestly.
You want to definitely avoid it unless you're playing gods, in which case all of your actions are by definition Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah, you might be able to use it if it's not a central conceit of your role-playing game, like time travel comes up once or twice as part of some wacky scientist or sinister cabal like in a modern game or a crazy wizard in a fantasy game or something where it's part of an adventure, it could work. But if you're having a campaign setting that is focused on time travel to some extent, the plastic time model is really the best way to go because it allows more player agency. At the same time, it prevents players from having too much agency. I mean, it is the most unrealistic model of time travel, unfortunately, but it's the best way to accommodate your players if you want to make it a thing. My vocabulary suddenly failed me there.
A constant experience.
So, yeah. So I think just as important as which model of time travel you want to use in a time travel setting in a role-playing game, what's most important is the setup. If you're going to have a role-playing game focused on time travel, there are a couple. I mean, I mentioned Continuum. There's also GURPS Time Travel. A couple others. What's the setup? What's the premise? What is the group doing? Are they time lost adventurers? Are they part of the time police? Are they time bandits? What's going on?
And what rules for time travel actually exist?
Well, we already covered that, but it's probably going to be plastic to some degree. But what setup works with that and the rules of time travel?
No, I don't mean whether it's plastic or fixed. I mean, is time travel an ability that a person can take with them?
Oh, I see.
Or does it have to be scheduled? Is there a time limit on it?
Mm-hmm. Are there and the time police? They're after you. So let's look at some examples of that in fiction. So Back to the Future is a classic example. We have a lone researcher. So there really aren't any agents working against them. It's just a small group or just sometimes one individual with some limited access to technologies often lost them, and therefore the adventurer is trying to reestablish that connection to time travel and or fix any problems made during their travels or try to improve the timeline.
Yeah, that's one option.
Those would be good for a limited set of a limited campaign, which would probably focus on one series. Because once you kind of escape back to your own timeline or find the time machine or fix the problems, I mean, where do you go from there? I mean, you have access to time travel machine technology, or you had to get rid of it to return to it. What are you going to do? It works better as a movie or novel. So because you're going to often have a group of people. They're all going to have different things they want to do. One person might want to continue time travel. The other person might say that's the end of it. So let's stop this. So that's one way, but it's not the best, I think. What other ones can you think of?
For things to adapt in order to use in a role-playing game setting? Well, one thing you could do is you could do it as the fixed version, but with a sharpshooter adaptation, so that you can go backwards in time, but time travel is only unidirectional. So you can go backwards in time and make a change as a party, and then the campaign takes place during that backwards time period as everything starts to now move forward in time. And the time machine isn't going to be invented for like another 500 years. So you're basically stuck doing a campaign from 500 years ago and seeing and having to experience the butterfly effects of all your actions throughout
the
history.
Terminator model, essentially. Yeah. So in that case, the the medium is also important. Like in that case, you're probably teleported back. The machine itself doesn't go back with you. You're just sent there.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That can be interesting because then it almost becomes kind of a.
There's also the time heist concept, where players play groups, or let's say time travel exists, but it has a kind of rubber band effect. You get sent back in time, you exist there for a brief period, and then you get snapped back to your original timeline. And the idea would be that you get thrown back in time to, let's say, the crash of the Hindenburg, and you're there to kidnap somebody who is literally about to die, so that they don't die because something about them is needed in the future. I mean, hell, maybe everybody in the future is sterile, and the only way the human race can procreate is by going back in time and snatching people who are about to die, and thus be removed from the timeline. timeline so that they don't get rubber banded back to the point of their death.
That would be a much better model for a typical role-playing game group, because with the former you discussed, the issue is at a certain time it stops being about time travel, once you're back there, and starts just being about a group of technologically advanced humans working with a group of less technologically advanced, I'm guessing, humans to correct some problem. It becomes more historical fiction, if anything else, which a lot of time travel is, but more of a time travel central conceit. It has to be something you can do more than once. And in the one you just mentioned, the latter, it becomes that's a really good framing device for an episode a day, or even a serial adventure for going back to some time period, accomplishing some task and going forward to further the ends of this far future. That'd be a great campaign setting.
Yeah, you could even have a standing style of opponent by saying that there's maybe the sterility was caused by an apocalyptic cult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they send their own agents back in time to try and stop you from snatching people or let's say you go back in time to get the guy off the Hindenburg. Only there's an assassination team back in time now trying to who's on the Hindenburg trying to kill him. Or if you also have some variation of the restriction on time travel where you can't go back further than the most recent time traveler, then then that would force temporal conflicts between these two parties.
All these are kind of variations of the time police or time patrol or time traveling society, where essentially time travel is a thing. You're a member of the society or brought into the society, and then you use the technology to accomplish something. Okay, the point is you're not freelancers, or at the very least you're in a society where your actions are watched or what you do is known. Time traveling is, you're not independent agents who discovered this thing like in Back to the Future.
Well, maybe you actually are independent agents, and the reason you're doing it secretly is because the world is now run or governed or influenced in some major way by said apocalyptic cult. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a colony of humans that can survive the nobody can have kids apocalypse after the last of those cultists dies off from old age.
I think there are a few anime series and or Netflix / Hulu / whatever streaming services which are focused on that. Yeah.
Probably. Probably somewhere.
I can't think of the names right now. So that's another thing you can do. Then there's a model I kind of like where this is almost a subgenre of the time traveling society where, well, you can apply to any of these actually, where you have a group of individuals from different timelines working together. Chrono Trigger is an excellent example of that, where you have a robot from the future, you have a cave woman warrior, you have a knight, you have three people from the present day, and they kind of act as a party. That's a great, that sort of model where you have time travel, but you can bring in different characters in different settings, gives a great variety of options for player characters. You could play a knight, you could play a time future guy, cyborg. At the same time, you can have a Bronze Age warrior. They're all stuck together in the same party, and they're having to work together. So that could be a great source of character interactions, a great variation party, and a lot of fun, honestly.
Yeah, it really could.
You just have to find a way of balancing that.
You would have to. Yeah, I was just about to say you just have to come up with some method of balancing it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in our system, basically the idea is that the more primitive characters are usually prime examples of their ilk, and therefore they have a lot of physical advantages that sort of overcome their technological limitations.
Well, if we're talking about the universal decay system, the more primitive characters have access to more primitive gear, and since there's gear level that reduces the XP that you earn from challenges, that means that they would be earning experience points faster than the more modern characters.
Yes, there's that, but also at character creation is what I meant here. You start out with better stats.
Oh, yeah.
Because the idea being, yes, you don't have access to modern medicine, modern technology, modern exercise equipment, but chances are if you're going to play a character, he's going to be a prime example of his ilk who have law basically survival of the fittest. They have survived despite all that, and hence they are prime physical, maybe even mental specimens. I mean,
they have to be more skillful,
more
healthy,
adaptable, more adaptable.
whatever.
Because think about it. Back in even Middle Ages, the scholars they had to learn how many languages on average to be considered scholars. They had to learn Latin. They had to learn French, English. That was actually brought up in the first 1632 model. They weren't stupid. They were actually in some ways more intelligent than their modern counterparts, because the modern counterparts relied upon things like computers and libraries. They had to learn all that shit in their head. So that's another balancing issue there. So that can definitely work. Just the idea is you have to have a goal. I think getting back to this, stepping back a bit, they have to have a goal. There has to be something for them to do. They have to have, saving the timeline, preventing the evil space/time Nazis from disrupting the timeline. There has to, the monster in the future will kill everyone. There has to be a focal for the adventuring party. Otherwise, they're just dicking around time. Well, that could be fun too, but I think more than most campaigns, you have to have a central focus for time travel games.
Or here's an idea: what if time travel only works because the invention of the time travel machine breaks reality, and now you have alternative timelines popping into the past history of the actual timeline. So you'd have things like dragons appearing in the air battle over Midway, and time travelers are from the future, and they have to go back in time to wipe out these fantasy influences on history.
Well, then you're starting to get almost in the cross-planner genre. I mean, again, admittedly, there's crossover between the two, but that's where it more falls under, I would think. We discussed that in length last time. But on that note,
I just like the idea of having to go back in time to assassinate Mecha Hitler.
Well, we all do. But again, if you want to do the model where time travel splits into different realities every time you time travel, that's almost to some extent just planar travel, but that's another way you can do time travel, where if you travel back to the Bronze Age and release a megavirus, your Earth is fine when you come back from it. I mean, if it's not the Back to the Future model you mentioned, where you're now stuck in that timeline, came back to your own timeline until you fix things. But if it's just you go back in time, it's just an alternate universe which happens to resemble past Earth. That's just, again, planar travel. But it's one way to get around the whole paradox issue. Of course, it's really one that's prone to abuse, because you have a society that has time travel to go to back in time, quote unquote, to, I don't know, the Bronze Age, and they just strip the place of all its resources, and then they head back home, and suddenly you're living on a planet Earth where there's virtually no iron, very little water. It's basically planar evasion. It's
let's see here. Well, there's actually an idea that I came up with that I wanted to bounce off of you and whatever listeners we actually end up having for this podcast, if you're up for it. Okay. You know how in Universal Decay and Heroes of Horror, we have everything based on an era or a civilization level system, where you have like the classical era, medieval era, Enlightenment, Renaissance, yada, yada, yada. Well, my idea would be, because let's face it, this would be it's a pretty good MMO idea. Would be you would have a server or server farm that it hosts one single world that is the game version of our world, but in the classical period, or the game version, and then another server that hosts it for the medieval, and another for the Renaissance, and so on and so forth. And what you could do is every year you would take whatever changes people or everybody's characters and whatever changes that they have made to the server that they're on, and forward step them one server. Then you can allow time travel via magic, machinery, whatever, back to for future server characters back to prior servers. However, when you time travel backwards, just to balance things out, just say that the force of time is trying to push you out, and as a result, your time traveled back to character's gear cannot be created on that server, and it cannot be repaired on that server. So if you go back in time with an AK-47 and 500 rounds, well, you better be sure you want to pop off those 500 shots.
It is an interesting concept of MMORPG. Of course, MMORPGs are kind of on the downside these days. Yeah.
I wouldn't say that they're on the downside. I would say that they're fractured. There's a lot of MMORPGs out there that are all trying to fight for the same audience of people who are interested in futuristic MMOs, people who are interested in kung fu MMOs, people who are interested in fantasy MMOs. But the problem is there's only a set number of people who are interested in those kinds of MMOs, and you need a certain player base to sustain an MMO. And if you're only able to get a fraction of that player base because you fractured the player base, you're not going to be able to survive. And that's what's happening right now. It's the World of Warcraft clone phenomenon. Only now it's like the World of Warcraft sci-fi version clone phenomenon, and kung fu version clone phenomenon, and so on and so forth.
Well, that's part of it. You're also having MMORPGs compete with things like Fortnite, shared smaller servers. I mean, it's fractured, and you're competing with these other online games that have different models instead of one continual cohesive world with thousands of players on. You have these smaller individual servers with smaller groups, which works out fine for everyone who want to role play with a smaller group and not have to pay the membership or the live service advertising costs. It's just very difficult to. There's a reason why MMORPGs have kind of died down. They're just too. There's so much to compete with it now, and there were too many of them. And it's it's a huge time investment. Players these days are much rather play more grinding games like Destiny or Fortnite, where it's all about character development across multiple servers, as opposed to developing one character on one server among a larger group. So it's a novel idea, but
sadly, that's true.
I'm not sure it would work, at least at this time, unless there was something really novel about the way it was brought about.
Oh, you mean the ability to run a character through multiple eras of time and see whatever changes you make in the past have
it would just come down to different servers and different worlds, unfortunately, I would think. And it would be a cool role play thing and a conceptual thing, but MMORPGs don't attract those sort of folks. They attract people who try to mini-max their characters and grind them to death. Then, of course, fuck with other players.
That's true.
I mean, you have role-playing groups in MMORPGs, but they tend to be as small subgroups.
Well, if you did it so that your characters actually experienced the flow of time, like let's say every year your characters basically age a decade.
What might work better is more a Dark Soulsy model where other players influence the game, but in more subtle ways and not directly.
Or allow players to make permanent alterations to the game space. Like you can actually build buildings in, let's say you build a cathedral in the classical period in the middle of the French countryside. Well, when that classical period server then gets upgraded to the medieval period server, that cathedral is now a medieval period.
You have to work some way to prevent abuse, but that might be interesting work. But I think we're getting off tangent now. So something to keep in the back of our minds, not with a whole lot of other things. So anything you want to add? We haven't mentioned Doctor Who yet, which I'm frankly surprised at.
That's because I've been really, really disappointed in Doctor Who recently. Like, to the point where I wish... the most recent seasons of Doctor Who have made me want to forget the series has ever
That's been going on for almost as long as Doctor Who, not liking certain seasons or doctors. That's not old.
It may not be old, but this is the first time in Doctor Who history where people are actually protesting Doctor Who in England.
Yeah, that is one venerable show. But before we go, let's talk about one more aspect of time travel, which I think is important, but we really only barely touched upon: the means of time travel. How does it happen?
That's true. Yeah.
So this also feeds into the campaign concept. Again, if it's a model where it's one way, it's probably not going to be that important. But if it's a model where you have access to time travel, how does it work? Is it a machine? It usually is a machine, or is it an innate ability, or is it a trained ability,
or is it a location where that you can go to, and it's like a doorway that you open up the door, and the other side of the door is 100 years in the past,
or is it a series of gateways? And if you have knowledge of how the gates appear, you can go wherever you want, but you need knowledge of how the temporal displacement is appearing and when and where it's at.
Yeah, the wormhole phenomenon that we were discussing earlier. It could, or is it some function of some factor of a closed time-like curve, where it's a combination of a machine and a location in space, but it can take you only to the start of the project.
In a time society, time police model, it's probably going to be either some sort of, teleportation device, a grand machine, or some sort of vehicle, possibly, or even something as simple as like or maybe it's a bit of both. There's a grand machine, there's some great, temporal displacer, but they can displace a person from in the past if they have the right signal, a little temporal locator thing.
What about this? This is something that we haven't touched on. What if we do use the whole rubber band idea, however you want to describe the rubber band idea, where you can travel in time, but after a set period of time, or maybe when you click a button or a locator or whatever, you get snapped back to the moment just after you left. But instead of going backwards in time, you go forwards in time. So you can go forward in time, like say you go forward 100 years and research natural disasters. And then you get snapped back, and you use that knowledge of natural disasters, or hell, maybe artificial disasters, and to go backwards in time to try and save people, or go backwards in time to just make a shit ton of money off of newspapers about future stock market trends.
That's a little side note. That's also another thing you have to avoid when it comes to plastic time adventuring. You got to prevent. If you can go forward in time to learn which horse is going to win the Derby, GMs have to find a way to limit that. Otherwise, players become rich very, very quickly, or make money just not an issue if you have like a time-spanning society.
Maybe the society is post-scarcity, so money is just not a thing because anybody can get anything that they need and most things that they want.
Exactly. So the mode of time travel does, to some extent, form the campaign. I mean, if it's something that's difficult, that could be the focal point of an adventure or even a campaign. If it's easy or something you just have to have, if it's material like the time displacer, that can still be a focus of an adventure, but it could also means it could just be a commonplace thing, like you can go back and forward. All you have to do is hit the signal or activate this device, and your masters in the time police displace you as need be. Or maybe there's a limitation. It takes X number of hours for it to charge up before you can go forward or backwards in time. Another model is that it's an inherent ability. In other words, you have either some sort of magical, maybe psionic, or even spiritual ability to move forward or backwards in time, which can make it
basically a superpower.
Exactly. And is it unique to an individual, or could any schlub, given enough training, learn how to do it?
In the Cape and Hammer book, I have a variation on time travel that allows you to take actions have your past self take actions that influence the present.
I mean, there's an example of that in fiction, in the Netflix / comic book series, the Umbrella School or Umbrella Society.
The Umbrella
Academy. Thank you. Yeah, or that's the focal point of the first main plot. That's when it's limited to one individual. So if that's done in a role-playing game setting, either everyone in the party or one person in the party has that ability, which makes them more important. That can be a little problematic. If it's ability which a lot of people have, which is an example of Continuum, the role-playing game, that makes it a little more balanced. So I think it might work a little better in a lot of time-spanning, time cop style camp settings. You even have certain abilities tied into this, discipline, this master of time, like becoming a time cop or becoming a time discipline. You learn how to speed up your individual time, and you can slow down time around you, basically real matrix effects, or you can do temporary time clones of yourself. That's one thing you can do.
one type of time travel campaign that we haven't touched on is the idea that the party are not the time travelers. That the time traveler is using the party as its agents in that time period via for one reason or another. Like maybe time travel can only be done telepathically. So you can, like, let's say, okay, how about this? The time travel machine allows you to talk to people in the past, but only those with whom you share a genetic legacy. So you can talk to your father, your grandfather, your great grandfather, so on and so on, backwards and further backwards in time. And maybe that's that, or maybe the person or your future descendant in the future is the time traveler, or maybe the party was just at ground zero in some weird chrono crystal explosion, and as a result, they're now like a homing beacon for future time travelers that can appear to them as like an Obi-Wan style hologram that only they can see and talk to. But whatever the reason, the time traveler is not or cannot actually cannot directly influence the past, and has to have somebody in the past do whatever that they need getting done, and that somebody is the party.
Mm-hmm. That's another way of doing it. Absolutely. Okay. So in general, I think in conclusion, the best model is going to usually be something. There isn't any. I don't think there's really a better mode of time travel, but it needs to fit the setting, needs to fit the situation the characters are in. If it's very difficult, if you're trying to do an escape from a certain period, or you're not spanning a lot of different time periods, it has to be usually a difficult to achieve device, or it has to be only one person can do it and it's hard to find, or it has to be a location that you have to get to at a certain time in a certain place. If it's more more of a time cop model, it has to be something that's easier to access, something which the players have easier access to just out of necessity. It can maybe be taken away from them as part of one adventure or part of one storyline, but overall they have to have more freedom to move through time or manipulate it for it to work.
Yeah, probably setting up a time travel campaign would be the hardest thing to set up and run.
I think that's a good way to kind of end note this on, is that time traveling campaigns, role-playing games, requires a lot of preparation. The GM has to do research, and they have to establish firm rules for how time travel works. And once it's done, you have to be able to accommodate player actions which might fuck with it.